Okay, so we're going to talk about classification taxonomy. We've already said that everything in our world could be divided into two groups. It's either abiotic or it is biotic. Biotic being living or once was living, made of cells. Then we said that all cells could be divided into two categories. They're either prokaryotic or they're eukaryotic. Okay, so we're going to find out where these 6 kingdoms come in to play, and that is something called taxonomy. So taxonomy is defined as a way of grouping organisms based on similarities. It would be like if I took all of the students in the junior high and I said, man, that's a really big group. Let's break it down into maybe smaller groups. So let's have all the 8th graders get in one group, and all the 7th graders will get in another group, and all the 6th graders will get in another group. And so now I have 3 groups, and each person in those groups has something in common. They're all in the same grade. And then I could take each of those groups and I could say, we need a smaller group, so let's take all of the 7th graders and divide them into boys and girls. Same thing for the 6th graders, and same thing for the 8th graders. And so then each of those 3 groups gets to be 2 groups. And then I could keep dividing it based on similarities. Like I could say, okay, I want all of the kids that are involved in UIL in one group, and all of the kids that are not in UIL in another group. Or I could divide them based up, are you in athletics, or are you in PE, or whatever. I could say, are you wearing tennis shoes, or are you wearing open-toed shoes? And then of the ones maybe that are wearing open-toed shoes, I could divide them again and say, are you wearing flats or heels? I could divide them based on how long their hair is. You know, you got short hair, you got long hair, whatever. I could keep dividing. Well, we have a way in science of grouping organisms based on their similarities. Now, this grouping changes as we get new information. So before they had the microscope, they couldn't see that things were made of cells. Once the microscopes got really improved, they could see that some of those cells had a nucleus and some of them didn't. And so then they said, hey, let's group them according to, do they have a nucleus in their cell or not? So we're going to have a prokaryotic and a eukaryotic. But they weren't able to do that until the technology got better, till the microscope got better. And so as our information changes, then so does our grouping. So it changes based on new information. Now, the scientist, the guy that came up with this, was named Carl Linnaeus. And I like the name Linnaeus because it uses almost every vowel except the letter O. This happened in the mid-1700s. We know that a century is 100 years, so middle, half of a century is 50 years. So around 1750, approximately, right? They had microscopes, and we had already had the development of the cell theory by Schleiden and Schwann. Schwann remember Schwann is like a swan, that's an animal, so he's the one that said, hey, all these animal cells that I'm looking at, or all these animals that I look at under the microscope are made of cells, so all animals must be made of cells. And then Schleiden came along and said, hey, you know what, I'm a botanist, I look at plants all day, and all these plants are made of cells, so I think all plants are made of cells. And so they came up with the idea that all living things, or all organisms, must be made of cells. And so that's where we talked about, the cell theory in all organisms. Living things are composed or made of cells, at least one or more. Cell is the basic unit of all life, and all cells come from pre-existing cells. We probably need to add the scientists' names down there. We may do that next week. But Carl Linnaeus added to that, and he developed a system of classifying organisms. Now, his system of classifying organisms pretty much consisted of looking at this underneath a microscope, and he started to notice, hey, all these plant cells look like boxes, and all these animal cells are kind of different shaped. And so maybe the plant cells have something in them that makes them more boxy-like, and I don't know, we're going to say that there's two groups. You either are a plant or you're an animal. So he only had two groups, and he based that on what they look like under the microscope and also how they got their energy. So if it was able to make its own food through photosynthesis, it was an autotroph, and therefore he said it was a plant. And if it had to consume other organisms, like other plants and animals, then it was a heterotroph, and therefore he said it was in the group Animalia. Now, this has evolved or changed over time. So when Carl Linnaeus was classifying organisms, there were just two groups, Animalia and Plantae. Late 1800s, as we get to improving our microscopes, we can see inside the cell more. They add things that used to be in the plant category, now they're in the protista category. When I was in school, there were 5 kingdoms. You had Animalia, plants, fungi, protista, and Monero. I never knew why they called it Monero instead of just bacteria. Later they did away with the Monero kingdom, and they called it Archaebacteria and Eubacteria. I'm sure years from now, as we continue to learn more, that maybe your children or grandchildren will come home with their science homework, and there will be, 7 kingdoms or 8 kingdoms. The more we know, the better we do, and the more we can classify things based on their similarities and their differences. Currently, there are 3 domains. There's archaea, there's bacteria, and there's eukaryotes. So these 2 domains, archaea and bacteria, both are prokaryotes, meaning they have no nucleus, and your eukaryote does have a nucleus. Now we're going to learn the levels of taxonomy. There are 8 of them, and you have to know them in order. It's kind of like when you learned all of the planets of the solar system, and it was important not just to know their names, but to know which one was closest to the sun, which one was next, which one was farthest, and all that. When I was in 6th grade, you were probably in 4th or 5th grade, because kids are smarter nowadays, we learned a memory device or a mnemonic sentence that helped us to remember the order of the planets. We learned, my very educated mother just served us 9 pizzas, because at that time Pluto, we didn't know enough about it to realize it wasn't really large enough to stay in a good orbit, and now it's still there, but it has been demoted as a true planet, and now it's a dwarf planet. I think that's size discrimination, if you ask me, being a short person. But so that sentence gave you the first letter of each of the planets. We're going to do the same thing, but we're going to use a different sentence. So our sentence we're going to write here in the margin. Now my sentence is, does King Philip come over for good soup? A lot of people say spaghetti, but when I was a kid I never could spell the word spaghetti, so I just said soup. Does King Philip come over for good soup? So the first letter is D, and that stands for domain. We said there were 3 domains. And the next letter is a K, and that stands for kingdom. And we said right now there are 6 of those. And the next letter is a P, which stands for phylum. And then a C for class, O for order, F for family, G for genus, and S for species. So this is in order from the largest group, the most in each category, all the way down to the smallest group. So that is the order of the taxonomy. Now, when we talk about genus and species, this would be like, for example, for a human, our genus is Homo and our species is sapien. We're Homo sapiens. That is our scientific name. We say that is called binomial nomenclature, which is a fancy word to say two-part name, okay? Two-part name. And every organism has a genus and a species, or a two-part name, that is called its scientific name. And the genus is always capitalized when we write it, and the species is never capitalized, and it's usually in that little squiggly font, italics. And so that lets scientists talk about organisms, and they're certain that they're talking about the same organism if they identify it with the genus and the species. Because what somebody calls a mountain lion in Texas and what somebody calls a mountain lion in Germany may not actually be the same big cat, okay? They're probably in the feline family, but they may not be the same genus and species. So if we're going to talk to scientists around the world, which we do now because we're a global communicators, we need to be sure as scientists that we have a common system of classifying organisms and being able to identify them. We know that a lot of scientists have different languages. Some speak French, some speak Spanish, some speak English, there's lots of different languages, but this is a common scientific language that we can use to communicate effectively. So this is on page 9. Important things: the guy's name, Linnaeus, what taxonomy is, and the order of taxonomy as in domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species.